They say peace is the sound of water, quiet, steady, certain. And for 23 years, that sound came from the pond at the back of my property, nestled in the curve of the cottonwoods, where the grass dipped low and the soil stayed damp long after summer turned everything else to dust. It wasn't grand, just a wide, still body of rain-fed water that shimmered in the morning light and steamed gently on cold winter days. But to me, it was sacred. It wasn't just a pond. It was part of the land's rhythm, something that felt older than fences and bylaws and power-hungry committees. And it was mine. I bought this house after retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers, back when my knees could still take a jog down the gravel drive, and I believed in things like quiet neighborhoods and respectful neighbors. The house sat on 3 acres, at the very edge of a suburban development called Clearbrook Ridge, an ironic name for a neighborhood that had neither a brook nor a ridge, just rows of beige homes with regulation mailboxes and precisely 2.5 trees per front yard. My property had been grandfathered in a technicality from before the HOA expanded its jurisdiction in 2003. While the newer homes sat shoulder to shoulder on postage stamps, my place was tucked behind a hedgerow, half hidden from the cul-de-sac, like a relic of a more honest time. The pond sat just beyond my vegetable garden, where I grew squash and tomatoes and corn, tall enough to cast shadows over the lettuce. In spring, frogs sang their night symphony, and in autumn, the wild geese dipped low for water before flying south. Kids from the next street over used to sneak through the back fence to fish for bluegill and toss stones. I never chased them off. I liked the sound of laughter more than silence. But more than all that, the pond mattered because it fed the aquifer that supplied my well. See, most of the newer homes in Clearbrook Ridge were connected to city water, metered, monitored, rationed. But not me. My well tapped into a deep, stable section of groundwater that had held steady for decades. During droughts, when the city issued watering bans and everyone's lawns turned brittle and brown, my garden stayed green. That little pond acted like a sponge. Every rainfall it captured, every trickle it held, sank slowly into the ground and kept the water table from slipping lower. It was natural engineering. It was science. It was balance. And yet no one on the HOA board seemed to care. Not at first. For years they left me alone. A few passive-aggressive letters here and there, something about my non-standard mailbox or the faded paint on my shed, but nothing serious. I paid the minimal dues out of courtesy, even though my property wasn't technically under their jurisdiction. But then came the shift. It started small. A new HOA president was elected, a woman named Cheryl Denton, who smiled like a realtor and wielded clipboards like swords. She was one of those people who believed rules were the same as morals, and that property values trumped common sense. At the first community meeting she hosted, Cheryl made a presentation about visual unity and curated landscapes. Her slideshow featured drone shots of other neighborhoods, perfect lawns, manicured trails, not a twig out of place. She talked about bringing the lake aesthetic to Clearbrook Ridge. Someone raised their hand and asked if that meant we'd get a community pool. Cheryl smiled sweetly and said, "Not exactly." The next day, a committee formed. They started measuring setbacks, cataloging architectural violations, and inspecting everyone's yards. For the betterment of all, the email said. I ignored most of it. My property was outside their jurisdiction. I wasn't breaking any laws. And frankly, I was too old and too tired to care about a clique of suburban bureaucrats playing pretend city hall. Until one afternoon when a man in a reflective vest showed up at the edge of my property. He didn't step onto the land, just stood there with a clipboard and a camera taking pictures of the pond from the sidewalk like it was some kind of crime scene. When I asked what he was doing, he just said, "Assessment for the HOA Beautification Initiative." That was the first red flag. The second came a week later, when I received a certified letter from the HOA board stating that the pond constituted an unapproved landscape feature that may negatively affect community cohesion and property values. They asked me as if it were polite to begin drainage and restoration to return the terrain to a more visually harmonious state. I laughed out loud when I read it. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked down to the pond that evening, coffee in hand, and watched the sun dip low behind the cottonwoods. The water mirrored the orange sky, soft and slow. I could see dragonflies skimming the surface, their wings catching light like fire. This was mine. It was the last place my wife and I sat together before the cancer took her. The last place my son caught a fish before he left for college. The one constant in my life after deployments lost change. And I wasn't about to let a board of self-important paper pushers take that away. Not quietly, anyway. The first real storm didn't come from the sky. It came in the form of a quarterly newsletter, 4 pages of glossy stock paper folded into my mailbox like a threat disguised as community spirit. The new letterhead read, Clearbrook Ridge, HOA, Preserving Beauty, Enforcing Standards. Below that, a smiling group photo of the board, Cheryl Denton dead center, with her flawless bob haircut and 2-inch smile, surrounded by 5 others who looked like they were cast from the same mold, neat suburban eager. Inside, the message was clear. A new vision for the neighborhood was underway. And this board wasn't asking for feedback. They were telling. Aesthetic consistency, curbside uniformity, harmonized natural views. That last one stuck with me. It was in that same newsletter that they outlined their latest mission, a landscape optimization campaign. It sounded like something out of a tech startup, but the implications were real. The HOA wanted to reassess all properties, yes, even grandfathered lots, for visual harmony with the community design palette. The language was soft, legalistic, and manipulative, but I knew what it meant. They wanted control over everything, even me. I wasn't surprised when they tried to rewrite the bylaws to extend their authority to the few remaining properties like mine. The older homes at the edge of the development had long been a sore spot for the HOA, reminders that they didn't own every blade of grass within the neighborhood boundaries. I was one of 4 homeowners who didn't have city water, didn't share their waste management contracts, and didn't abide by their lawn care schedules or architectural restrictions, and I knew they hated that. When Cheryl Denton ran for HOA president, she made her position clear in whispers and small talk. We need to integrate all lots. Most folks didn't care, but a few fell for her vision. Once she got elected, she pushed for a universal compliance amendment, arguing that Clearbrook Ridge needed to speak with one visual voice. The phrasing made me sick. They didn't send inspectors right away. That came later. First, they sent a wave of emails, friendly reminders, surveys, and feedback requests about problem areas in the community. But the language grew more aggressive by the week. Then the door knockers started. Volunteers in HOA polos with clipboards. Most of my neighbors caved. I watched one of them, a young dad named Marcus Sweet Guy, rip out 3 mature elms from his front yard because they weren't on the approved tree list. His 6-year-old daughter cried as the arborist's chainsaw growled to life. And just like that, shade was replaced by uniformity. The transformation was fast. Overnight lawns turned synthetic green. Mailboxes were swapped out for identical units with built-in LED numbers. Garden beds were sterilized into symmetry. The neighborhood lost its soul in under 6 months. And all the while, the pond sat quiet. It became, I imagine, an offense to their eyes. Not because it was ugly, but because it refused to be tamed. It curved when they wanted straight. It shifted with the seasons when they wanted static beauty. It reminded them of something they couldn't own, so they set their sights on it. Cheryl Denton started slow-dropping lines during community meetings like, "We've had some concerns about non-conforming water features, and natural doesn't always mean safe or clean." She even suggested that the standing water might be a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and hinted that it could be lowering home values. When I stood up at the next meeting to correct her, explaining how the pond supported native species, how it fed the water table, how it was legally outside their domain, she smiled thinly and said, "Well, maybe it's time for everyone to be on the same page." That's when I knew she wasn't just power-hungry. She was dangerous. Not in the criminal sense. No, Cheryl wasn't sloppy. She was precise. She was the kind of dangerous that hides behind technicalities and wraps malice in protocol. She believed that improving the neighborhood was justification enough to ignore the lives that were already there. And she was building support. I saw it in the nods from the back row, in the silent indifference of neighbors who'd once waved to me over fences. One by one, people stopped caring about what was fair and started focusing on what was best for the community. Best, of course, meaning best for property values. I spent a few nights sitting by the pond, turning it all over in my mind. The still water reflected everything. My reflection older now, more worn than I'd allowed myself to admit. The trees, the stars, the shape of a neighborhood I no longer recognized. Part of me wondered if I was just being stubborn, holding on to the past. But then I thought about the frogs, the herons, the deer that came in the morning to drink. I thought about how my wife used to sit on the dock and read how my son used to drag out lawn chairs and pretend it was a pirate ship. And I knew this wasn't just about water. This was about memory. This was about place. This was about holding on to the last real thing I had. So when the HOA board voted, without me present, to officially classify the pond as an unsanctioned water feature subject to remediation, I didn't get angry. I didn't storm the next meeting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even respond to the email. I just sat on the dock that night with a notebook and wrote down everything I remembered about building that well system, every measurement, every pipe, every contour of the land. I drew out maps. I labeled elevations. I logged the rainfall from the last 10 years. I knew what they didn't. I knew what would happen if they messed with that pond. They thought they were just draining a puddle. They had no idea they were pulling the plug on their own water supply. But they would. Very soon. It started with a photograph. Glossy, full color, and taken with the kind of zoom lens that only someone with no shame or a drone would use. It showed my pond from above, framed between trees that were mid-shed for the fall. The water was dark from leaf cover. A few cattails leaned in from the banks. The image was included on page 2 of the HOA's next community bulletin under a bold headline, Visual Disharmony, a Case for Neighborhood Improvement. They didn't name me. They didn't have to. Everyone in Clearbrook Ridge knew exactly whose property was being displayed like a bad example in a middle school behavior chart. The photo was paired with a caption that read, Unmanaged natural spaces can detract from community values and pose safety hazards to children and pets. Hazards. The word pulsed in my chest like a warning siren. It wasn't just an insult, it was groundwork, laying the foundation for action, reframing my pond not as a natural ecosystem or part of my property, but as a public nuisance, a threat. And threats, as I well knew from a lifetime in public service, could be neutralized. I went straight to the HOA office that afternoon. It wasn't a real office, just a prefab trailer they set up beside the community clubhouse. I found Cheryl Denton sitting behind a folding table typing away on a laptop that matched her beige blouse almost exactly. She looked up and offered that familiar fake smile. Mr. Weller, to what do we owe the pleasure? You owe me a retraction, I said, and an apology. For what exactly? She kept smiling, hands folded neatly in front of her, like she was posing for a commercial about customer service. You published a photo of my land, private land, without consent. You labeled my pond a hazard. You're inciting the community against me. We're simply documenting areas of concern, she replied. We have a responsibility to maintain neighborhood standards. You don't have responsibility over my property, I snapped. I'm not under your jurisdiction. Her smile thinned just slightly. We're in the process of unifying the community under one consistent code. Grandfathered exemptions are outdated, Mr. Weller. They encourage division. And in the long run, they hurt everyone's investment. There it was again, property values. The only thing these people seem to care about more than their perfectly trimmed lawns. Your obsession with uniformity is going to destroy the one thing that gives this place any character, I said, leveling my voice. That pond is not just some mud hole. It's part of the aquifer. Drain it, and you lower the water table. You risk a lot more than aesthetics. She raised her eyebrows like I just claimed the pond had magical healing powers. I've reviewed the environmental impact report, Mr. Weller. The pond is not classified as a protected water source. I stared at her. What report? A third-party consultant, she said. We commissioned a survey last month. We're happy to provide a copy. I want the name of that consultant. Her smile returned. All requests must be submitted in writing. I left before I said something I'd regret. That night, I printed out the original land survey from when I bought the property, along with groundwater data I'd tracked over the past 2 decades. I sent it in hard copy to the HOA office certified mail. Attached was a cover letter. To the Clearbrook Ridge HOA Board. Be advised that the pond located at 1899 Pine Slope Road is private property and does not fall under your legal authority. Any attempt to alter, remove, drain, or interfere with this structure will be considered trespass and destruction of private property. Further, any manipulation of the local water table may result in civil and environmental liability. You have been warned. C. Weller. For 2 weeks I heard nothing. Then the flags appeared. Little orange markers poked into the ground along the slope between the HOA's easement trail and the edge of my pond. Survey flags. They didn't knock, didn't notify me, just walked the line while I was at the hardware store as if my land was a future construction site. That's when I installed the motion sensor cameras. I wasn't taking chances. I knew how these things escalated. I'd seen it in other neighborhoods. Neighbors turned informants, lines blurred, private property lines redrawn overnight. And I had no doubt they were building a case. The next HOA meeting was packed. The bulletin had done its job. People were buzzing about the pond, like it was a mythical monster threatening to swallow their home equity. I sat in the back of the room silent as Cheryl unveiled her next move. Remediation recommendation, number 14, unregulated water features. She clicked a remote, and the screen flashed with bullet points, runoff risk, mosquito vectors, drowning hazards. Then came another photo. Mine again. This time from ground level, zoomed in to make the cattails look wild, the surface looked dark. She was trying to make it look ugly. But I knew what she feared most wasn't how it looked, it was what it represented. Wildness, autonomy, defiance. I raised my hand. She didn't call on me, but I stood anyway. I have the deed, I said loudly, voice steady, and I have groundwater data proving that the pond supports the well system that feeds 4 properties including mine. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Cheryl gave a tight smile. Mr. Weller, this meeting is for the board's presentation. I kept going. Drain that pond and you risk destabilizing the water table. The city's own zoning documents reference this parcel as ecologically unique. Cheryl looked annoyed now. We appreciate your input, but the board will move forward with its plans. On what authority? She paused. We're acting in the best interest of the community. That line landed like a hammer. Because the community was the word they always used to silence the individual. I looked around the room and saw the faces of people I'd known for years. Some turned away. Some avoided my eyes. One man, John, who used to borrow my ladder, gave me a weak shrug like, "What can I do?" I walked out. But I knew then beyond any doubt they weren't going to stop. This wasn't about beautification. This was about erasure. They wanted me to disappear, to fold in, to surrender. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had already begun preparing for the worst. I had stored water, backed up documents, hired a hydrologist friend from my core days to write a report. Because this was no longer just about the pond. This was about the line in the sand, the stand I was willing to make. And what they were about to do next would change everything, not just for me, but for every single home on this side of Clearbrook Ridge. They were about to go too far. And they wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. I remember the exact moment I knew they'd done it. It was early, barely past 6 a.m., when I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and headed toward the back garden, expecting to hear the usual hum of frogs, the soft splash of fish near the cattails, the creak of ducks waddling out from under the willow branches. But there was nothing. No sound, no water, just mud. Thick black rotting mud where my pond had been. A sunken crater bleeding moisture like a wound that had been ripped open overnight. The dock sat crooked, half its frame collapsed inward like a man who'd lost his spine. I dropped the coffee. The cup hit the ground shattered, and I didn't even blink. It felt like I'd just walked in on a murder scene, because that's what it was. Someone had come in the night and killed the pond. My boots squelched through the edge of the muck as I walked the perimeter, eyes scanning for evidence. It didn't take long. On the western side, hidden behind the tall shrubs that divided my yard from the HOA's walking trail, I found the makeshift trench. Freshly dug. A narrow channel roughly 18 inches deep, cut straight through my embankment and into the HOA's drainage ditch. Still damp. Still draining. There was no attempt to hide it, no effort to fill it back in, just blatant calculated destruction. And it hadn't been done by amateurs. I recognized the method, the way the earth had been cut with precision, the angle of the trench matching the natural slope. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing, and that made me furious. Not just because they trespassed, not just because they destroyed something sacred, but because they had weaponized knowledge, my own field, against me. I stormed back to the house, hands shaking, and pulled up the security footage from the motion sensor cameras I'd installed near the trees. At 2:17 a.m., the screen lit up. 3 men, fluorescent vests, headlamps, shovels. No trucks, no lights, no engines. Just manual labor in the middle of the night. Efficient, quiet, illegal. One of them paused halfway through and looked toward the camera. He had a clipboard, and on the back of his vest, a patch Clearbrook Ridge beautification team. They hadn't even tried to hide it. I called the sheriff's office immediately, but when I explained the situation, they hesitated. "Sir, is this an active crime scene?" the deputy asked. "Yes. Trespassing. Property destruction. Environmental tampering. And you said the individuals were affiliated with your neighborhood's HOA?" "Yes." There was a pause, a long one. "Well, sir, you'll want to file a civil complaint, possibly speak to an attorney. These disputes usually fall under HOA covenants or private arbitration." I hung up. I wasn't stupid. I'd seen this play before. Unless someone was caught red-handed with a crowbar or a weapon, the law didn't want to touch HOA matters, especially when the HOA had money, legal resources, and plausible deniability. But I had footage, and I had history, and I had a fire in my chest I hadn't felt since Kandahar. So I documented everything, photographed the trench from every angle, measured the depth, took water samples from the remaining mud, saved the footage to 3 separate drives, and emailed a copy to my lawyer friend Elena in Tucson. Then I got in my truck and drove straight to the HOA office. It wasn't open yet. Didn't matter, I waited. By 8:03 a.m., Cheryl Denton pulled into the lot in her white Mercedes SUV, sunglasses perched like a crown on her forehead. She didn't see me until I stepped out of my truck and stood in front of her driver's side door. She flinched, then smiled. "Mr. Weller," she said, too sweet, "you're up early. You drained my pond." Her expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. "I'm sorry. You sent a crew in the middle of the night to trench into my embankment and redirect the water. I think you're mistaken. I have footage. 3 men in HOA vests, clipboard, headlamps, 2:15 in the damn morning. A beat." Then she smiled again. "If anyone performed maintenance on community property, I assure you it was for safety reasons." "My pond is not community property," I snapped. "You had no right." She stepped around me, heels clicking on the pavement, and unlocked the trailer door. "Mr. Weller, if you believe something improper occurred, I suggest submitting a written complaint. Otherwise, I'll consider this conversation concluded." She closed the door in my face. I stared at it for a long time, my fists clenched. Then I turned and walked away. But I didn't go home. I drove to City Hall. Inside the Planning and Zoning Department, I asked for every document on file regarding Clearbrook Ridge HOA's jurisdiction, any amendments made in the last 12 months, and the original parcel map of my property. The clerk, a young man named Ryan, was kind enough to help me. As he pulled up the files, I asked about any recent permit requests. He scanned the log, then looked up confused. "There was a trenching permit filed 2 weeks ago," he said, "for a stormwater diversion project." My stomach sank. "Who filed it?" He turned the screen. "Applicant: Clearbrook Ridge, HOA. Location: adjacent to Walking Trail Phase 3. Purpose: drainage improvement to prevent pooling and mosquito risk. Approved by Interim City Inspector. Date: Thursday, 4:42 p.m. They'd filed a permit on city easement land, but that easement didn't include my pond. I asked to print it. He obliged. I walked out of that office with a file folder of evidence and a resolve harder than concrete. They thought they could do this quietly, that no one would fight back, that I'd roll over like Marcus and the Elms, like every other soul in the neighborhood who traded dignity for HOA approval. But I wasn't them. I was the wrong man to pick a fight with. I called Elena. "I'm ready," I said. She didn't even hesitate. "Send me everything. We'll hit them from 3 angles: civil trespass, environmental violation, and property damages. And while we're at it, let's loop in the state water board." I hung up my hands, no longer shaking. Out back, the pond was still a scar. But scars heal, and sometimes they remind us what we're fighting for. It began with a scream. Not the kind you hear in nightmares, but the raw, frustrated, real-life howl of someone turning on a faucet and getting nothing but air. It came from across the cul-de-sac Ms. Halbert's place. She was in her 70s, lived alone, and loved to water her roses at 600 a.m., sharp as she had every day since I moved in. But that morning, instead of the slow hiss of a garden hose, her shout rang out like a siren cutting through the dawn. Then came the second scream, this time from the Sanders household 2 doors down. I heard their front door slam open, the sound of flip-flops slapping pavement, and the unmistakable profanity of someone who hadn't had their morning coffee or shower. By 6:15, the neighborhood was waking up in a panic. The sidewalks filled with pajama-clad homeowners wielding coffee mugs and cell phones, all pressing buttons and tapping apps that couldn't fix what was happening. The water was gone. No warning, no notice, no pressure in the lines, just dry taps and cold silence. I stood at my kitchen sink, filled a pot with water from the faucet, and placed it on the stove for tea. Everything in my house still worked. Perfect pressure, clear, cool water. My well was untouched, because I'd built it right, shielded it, designed it to run independently, and I hadn't sabotaged myself. I opened the back door and stepped outside, letting the cool morning air drift into the kitchen. From the deck, I could see the hollow where the pond used to be. The trench that had gutted it had already begun to crack at the edges, drying into jagged, ugly lines. There was no mistaking it now. They hadn't just drained a pond. They'd drained the neighborhood. By 7:00 a.m., the HOA group chat. Yes, I had access to it. thanks to a neighbor who despised Cheryl as much as I did, was melting down. Sharon P89. Anyone else have zero water pressure? Michael Ridge. Yep, faucet's dry, shower's not working. HOA C. Denton. We're aware of a possible disruption and are working with the city to assess. Please remain calm. The real John D. Why is it only our side of the development? I sipped my tea. Then I heard a car door slam fast and angry. Cheryl. She was marching up the street with her clipboard in hand, her perfectly pressed blouse already wilting from stress. A small entourage followed Rick from the board, that lanky intern from the landscaping team, and a man in a city utility vest. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't dare. They went to the Halberds first, then the Sanders. Then house by house, clipboard scribbles and hurried conversations, the group shrinking in confidence with every frustrated homeowner they met. By 9:00 a.m., they were back at the HOA trailer, and Cheryl was red-faced and pacing like a general on a losing battlefield. I stood on the edge of my lawn, arms crossed. She finally looked over. Our eyes met. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. She turned away first. By noon, a statement was issued. Clearbrook Ridge, HOA emergency notice. Due to unforeseen infrastructure issues, portions of the water supply in Phase 3 are experiencing disruptions. We are working with city services to restore function as soon as possible. Please conserve bottled water and avoid using irrigation systems. Thank you for your cooperation. It was such a weak lie it almost made me laugh. Because I had exactly what they didn't fax. The waterline maps in City Hall made it clear this part of Clearbrook Ridge sat atop a shallow, sensitive section of the aquifer. My pond had acted as a recharge zone. Without it, the groundwater dropped nearly 4 feet in under 24 hours. 4 feet was enough to dry out shallow wells and strain even the city's auxiliary feeds. They hadn't just pulled a plug. They'd cracked the basin. And the worst part, they had no plan to fix it. That afternoon, I loaded my truck with a few jugs of water filtered from my well and drove down the cul-de-sac. I stopped at Ms. Halberds, gave her 2 gallons and a smile. Then the Sanders, the Vasquezes, the Garcias. I didn't charge a dime, not yet. But word spread like wildfire. The man with the pond, the man they tried to shut down, was the only one still standing. By nightfall, I had people lining up at my back fence. They brought empty jugs, old milk bottles, even coolers. They didn't say much. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked desperate. I didn't turn them away. But I also didn't forget. Not one of these people had spoken up at the meeting. Not one had defended the pond. Not one had stood between me and the board when they dug the trench like thieves in the night. And now they wanted help. Of course they did. Still, I filled the jugs. Because water like dignity should never be denied. But I didn't stop there. That night, I opened the locked cabinet in my garage, the one labeled Archive. Inside were blueprints, military-grade maps, soil surveys from my Corps years. I pulled out the hydrology reports I'd kept tucked away, cross-referenced the data I'd gathered over the years with recent rainfall numbers. Then I booted up my laptop and drafted a report titled, Incident Analysis, Unauthorized Drainage of Retention, Ecosystem, Resulting in Regional Aquifer Instability. I CC'd it to Elena, my lawyer, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, the city's Environmental Oversight Committee, and a local news station I knew loved stories about HOA abuse. By the time I clicked send, the sky had darkened, and Clearbrook Ridge was facing its first real night without water. But I slept just fine, because I knew what was coming. And I wasn't the one about to get flooded with lawsuits, with press, and with karma. The first knock came at 7:42 a.m. sharp, a timid rapping, 3 soft taps on the front door. When I opened it, there stood Cheryl Denton, looking like someone had taken a wire brush to her composure. The neatly curled hair was frizzed at the ends. Her makeup had cracked around her eyes. And for the first time since she took office, the clipboard was gone. She clasped her hands politely. "Mr. Weller," she said, voice low and civil, like nothing had ever happened between us. "May I come in?" I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. "No," I said flatly. She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "I'll get straight to the point. The board is working closely with the city, but water restoration is delayed. We're asking residents to conserve. A few families mentioned you still have a working well." I waited. She fidgeted. "We'd like to request your cooperation in supplying emergency water until city systems stabilize." That word cooperation, it made my jaw tighten. "You mean the same city system your board undermined when you drained the pond feeding it?" I said. Her expression flickered. That was not the intention. Our goal was visual alignment. Don't, I said. Don't pretend this was an accident. You filed the trench permit yourself. You knew what that pond did. You ignored the data. I warned you. Her eyes flashed. The board believed. Your belief doesn't replace science, Cheryl, or ownership rights. I stepped a little closer, lowering my voice. You broke the law, and you broke the land. She shifted uncomfortably, the defensive posture creeping back in. Mr. Weller, I understand you're upset, but we need unity right now. You didn't want unity. You wanted control. She said nothing. I leaned against the porch rail and glanced past her at the line of people already forming on the sidewalk, with empty jugs and sunken shoulders. Let me guess, I said. You want to organize a community water station run by me, managed by the HOA, branded as some feel-good PR move. She didn't deny it. I chuckled dryly. You really think you can spin this? I think people are scared, Charles. She used my first name like a lever. You should be too, I said, because this isn't just a temporary inconvenience. This is a systems failure. Your board made it happen, and now you want the man you vilified to clean up your mess. I'm trying to prevent panic. No, you're trying to preserve your position. Her face hardened. So that's a no. I looked her dead in the eyes. You want water? Wait your turn in line, like everybody else. She blinked. I thought she might explode. But she didn't. She nodded stiffly and walked away, heels crunching on the gravel like firecrackers. By mid-morning, the line had doubled. I set up a folding table near the side gate filled with refill spigots and 3 large food-grade barrels. I wrote one rule on a dry erase board in thick black letters. Limit 3 gallons per household, no exceptions. Some folks thanked me quietly. Others avoided eye contact, the shame of last week's silence still hanging over them like dust. But a few tried to push it. One man, Doug Kessler, a board member, walked up with a 10-gallon tub on wheels and a smug grin. Come on, Chuck, he said. We've got 3 kids. Just top me off. You've got 2 kids, I said, not smiling. And a sprinkler system that never turned off. He rolled his eyes. Let's not make this political. No, I said. Let's make it fair. I handed him 3 one-gallon jugs and turned to the next person. Doug left fuming, but he didn't argue again. Word spread fast. That night, I got a text from my lawyer, Elena. City Council opened inquiry into HOA Board. Water Board requesting statement. Want you to testify. I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't set out to become anything more than a man protecting what was his. I wasn't an activist. I wasn't a politician. I just wanted peace, and they dragged me into war. But now they'd given me a platform, and I wasn't wasting it. The next morning, I received a letter. Hand-delivered. No stamp, just slipped under my door. It read, Mr. Weller, we, the undersigned residents of Clearbrook Ridge, apologize for the board's recent actions and your treatment by our community. We support your efforts to restore the pond and hold the HOA accountable. If there is anything we can do, labor fundraising testimony, please let us know. Sincerely, 37 households of Clearbrook Ridge. 37. Nearly half the neighborhood. I stood there for a moment staring at the signatures. Some names surprised me. People I hadn't spoken to in years. A few I'd thought had turned against me. People were waking up. Finally. I walked to the garage and pulled out the backup generator I hadn't used since my wife's last round of chemo. Hooked it up to a secondary filtration pump I'd kept sealed in a storage barrel. Then I hauled the coiled black hose to the edge of the dried pond basin. If they were serious, if this wasn't just panic-fueled guilt, then maybe there was a way forward. But not without accountability. Not without truth. I sent a message to the news station, ready to talk. Interview at my property. Bring a camera crew. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something besides rage. I felt momentum. Not just for me, but for every person who'd been steamrolled by a board silenced by policy or shamed into silence by the false gods of property values. Maybe, just maybe, this was the crack in the dam. And maybe, just maybe, the flood was coming. City Hall smelled like bureaucracy. The air was too cold, the walls too beige, and the sound of shoes on tile echoed like decisions being delayed. But I wasn't there to wait. I wasn't there to ask. I was there to bring hell. I arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled hearing with 2 large binders under one arm and a flash drive in my pocket. Elena had helped me organize everything. Photos, timestamps, video footage, water table, data, legal ownership documents, city parcel maps, trench permits, and a written affidavit from a hydrologist, backing my claim that draining the pond had directly contributed to groundwater collapse. When the receptionist asked what department I was here to see, I didn't hesitate. Planning and zoning. Then utilities oversight. Then public comment session with City Council. She blinked. All today. All before lunch, I said. I started with planning and zoning. I dropped the binder on the desk of a startled administrator named Marcia, who quickly realized I wasn't some crank with a conspiracy theory, but a man with evidence. She read through the trench permit the HOA had filed, the one that claimed to be for drainage optimization, and her face fell. This was meant for runoff management, she said quietly. I pointed to the date stamp. They filed this permit 2 days after I refused their request to drain my pond. They used a city-sanctioned form to commit unauthorized work on private land. My land. She swallowed. That wasn't authorized. That's a serious problem. No, I said. It's negligence with consequences. I handed her a printout of the subdivision map circled in red where my pond had sat, and how the trench crossed into the HOA walking trail. Whoever approved this didn't cross-check boundaries, I added. And now you've got 37 homes without water and a neighborhood in freefall. Her fingers hovered over the phone. I need to call my supervisor. You do that. 15 minutes later, I was escorted upstairs to utilities oversight. There, I met with a man named Calvin, a lanky bureaucrat with thick glasses and a tired look of someone who'd read too many incident reports in one lifetime. I gave him my flash drive. He plugged it in, clicked through the folders, and sat up straighter with every file he opened. You documented everything he asked. I'm an engineer, I said. Retired. But the instincts don't retire. He nodded slowly. And you believe this pond acted as a recharge zone for your well? I know it did, I said. My readings prove it. It was the only natural retention body on this half of Clearbrook Ridge. The second they opened that trench, they interrupted the equilibrium. You can trace the water loss straight to that moment. And the HOA claims it was for mosquito control. I laughed bitterly. They called it an eyesore. They had a vendetta, not a vector. He sighed and shook his head. If this is true, and it certainly looks like it is, it qualifies as an environmental disruption under the state groundwater management statutes. Good, I said, because I'm filing a formal grievance. He nodded. You'll want to do that through the city attorney's office, but I'll flag this internally and escalate it to our compliance unit. This isn't going away quietly. Neither am I. By the time I arrived at the city council chamber, word had already started to spread. Reporters were waiting in the lobby. Not many, just 2 local outlets, but enough to draw attention. One of them recognized me from the viral HOA water thread that had hit the community Facebook page the night before. Mr. Weller, is it true you warned the HOA about this in advance? Yes, I said. Do you believe the board intentionally targeted your property? I looked straight into the lens. They didn't just target it. They trespassed, they vandalized, and they triggered a water crisis for 37 families. All because they thought aesthetics were more important than science or ownership. Will you be pressing charges? I turned to the camera. I'm not just pressing charges, I said. I'm pressing truth. And I won't stop until the board answers for what they've done. Inside the chamber, I signed up for the public comment session and waited. When my name was called, I walked to the podium and set both binders on the council's desk with a loud thunk. The microphones picked up the weight of it. The air shifted. I didn't prepare a speech. I spoke from memory, from pain, from the ache in my chest where peace used to live. I told them about the pond, the trench, the secret crew in the night, the day the faucets went dry, the 37 signatures, the old woman who now had to use bottled water to bathe, the kids who couldn't flush toilets, the silence from the HOA trailer. I told them about the arrogance that comes from unchecked power, about how boards like these hide behind bylaws and buzzwords and throw dirt on the people who built the land they now claim to protect. I ended with one sentence. Clearbrook Ridge deserves better than a board that drains the life out of its own people. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then one council member leaned forward. Do you have documentation to support your claims? I tapped the binder. More than you're ready for. He nodded. We'll be investigating. When I left the chamber, the reporters were waiting. This time, they weren't asking if I planned to sue. They were asking if I planned to run for the board. I laughed. But deep down, I didn't say no. Not yet. That night, as I sat on the back deck looking out over the crater where the pond once lived, I felt the air shift. Not in the weather, in the people. I heard neighbors talking again, not about the latest rule from Cheryl or what color the HOA wanted their shutters painted, but about how they could help, how they could vote, how they could change things. The water hadn't come back, but something else had started to flow, and I wasn't alone anymore. By sunrise the next morning, I wasn't just the guy with the pond anymore. I was a headline. Retired engineer. Fights back. After HOA drains pond, causes water crisis. Clearbrook Ridge residents, left dry as HOA faces backlash. From quiet neighbor to local hero, Charles Weller takes a stand. Local Channel 12 aired the interview I'd done outside City Hall less than 12 hours earlier. They played the clip of me saying, "They didn't just drain a pond, they drained trust." It must have hit a nerve because by 8 a.m., my phone had blown up with voicemails, texts, and emails from strangers, veterans, homeowners, even city officials thanking me for standing up to those people. But it wasn't just words anymore. The consequences were finally arriving. The mayor's office issued a public statement that morning. The city of Larkspur has launched a full inquiry into the actions taken by the Clearbrook Ridge HOA concerning the unauthorized trenching and its impact on water access for area residents. They were careful not to assign blame outright, but the message was clear. The city had been caught asleep at the wheel, and now they were scrambling to distance themselves. By noon, the Arizona Department of Water Resources had placed a temporary hold on any future HOA landscape projects and sent a hydrologist to assess the damaged aquifer. And Cheryl Denton, she went quiet. No more community bulletins. No more HOA press statements. Her usual Wednesday beautification walk was canceled. Her car was seen parked at the far end of the neighborhood away from her own house. Even the board members began to jump ship. Rick, the same man who'd smirked his way through the vote to reclassify my pond, resigned that afternoon. His resignation letter cited a difference in vision and increasing hostility. Translation: the heat was too much, and he wanted out before the fire reached him. That evening, I was asked to attend a town hall meeting, not HOA organized, but one put together by residents. They held it at the old community clubhouse, a place I hadn't stepped into in years because I couldn't stomach the scent of chlorine and faux civility. But this time was different. It was standing room only, folding chairs packed wall to wall. People I hadn't spoken to in a decade sat beside folks I'd never met before, all nodding and whispering and clenching papers like they were waiting for a revolution. A woman named Carmen stood at the front, one of the mothers who'd come to me for water with her toddler cradled on her hip. She held a microphone and addressed the crowd. For too long, she said, this board has operated in silence behind closed doors, under the assumption that no one would challenge them. That ended the night they drained Mr. Weller's pond. Applause followed, slow at first, then growing. I didn't expect it. I didn't know what to do with it. Carmen continued. We're here to take our community back, and we're asking Mr. Weller to help us do it. She turned to me. I stood. Not because I wanted recognition, not because I wanted power, but because I saw in that moment what Cheryl never could, that people weren't drawn to control. They were drawn to courage, to truth, to someone willing to stand when it mattered. I'm not here to run for anything, I said. I'm here to rebuild, not just the pond, but the trust, the decency, the balance. I paused, then added, but I'll help you do whatever it takes to make this HOA accountable. We didn't move here to be ruled. We moved here to live. That got a standing ovation. Me, the grumpy widower with the well, the guy who never joined the HOA BBQs. I couldn't believe it. Later that night, Carmen handed me a petition, dozens of signatures, requesting a vote of no confidence against the current HOA board. That same week, Elena filed our civil suit officially. Trespassing, destruction of private property, negligent disruption of environmental systems, violation of municipal permitting standards. And we weren't alone. A second lawsuit was filed, this time by 4 other homeowners who discovered their water lines had been impacted by the same drainage shift. A class action suit was forming. HOA insurance was about to get torched. The pond still looked like a scar, but work had already begun. A local environmental nonprofit caught wind of the story and offered to help us restore the wetland zone, free of charge. They brought in native plant experts, hydrologists, and even a small team of volunteers from the university. For the first time in weeks, the ground didn't feel cursed. One morning, I woke up to the sound of a teenager digging post holes for a temporary barrier around the pond's basin. Another was raking debris. A third handed me a granola bar and said, "You're kind of famous." I smirked, hope I don't let it go to my head. But the truth was, I didn't feel pride. I felt relief, like something old and heavy had been set down finally. The HOA board. They tried to push back. A weak press release claimed the board had acted in good faith and were committed to community well-being. But nobody was buying it anymore. People had learned to ask for proof. They'd learned to push back. The petition hit 120 signatures by week's end, enough to trigger a special election. Cheryl Denton didn't respond to the notice. She resigned instead. 2 other board members followed. In less than 10 days, the power structure that had ruled Clearbrook Ridge for years collapsed. And the vacancy, well, that was up to the people to fill. I stood by the edge of the basin that night, the sky soft with stars, the air wet with the promise of rain. The pond wasn't back yet, but it would be. And more than that, the neighborhood felt awake. Not perfect, not all friendly, but alive in a way that mattered. Less afraid, more honest. A girl rode her bike past the sidewalk and waved. I waved back. The frogs hadn't returned, but I could imagine them. Soon. Very soon. They say the last gasp of a dying empire is always the loudest. The HOA board. What was left of it anyway, wasn't going down without a fight. 2 weeks after Cheryl resigned and the pond restoration began, I received a certified letter, bold, legal, and utterly predictable. It was a cease and desist. The letter accused me of defamation, willful obstruction of HOA operations, and unauthorized distribution of false information leading to reputational harm. They claimed I had incited unrest among residents and demanded that I retract my public statements or face litigation. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, the letter spread out before me like a joke I'd already heard before. They didn't even spell Elena's last name right on the carbon copy. But still, it rattled something in me. Because I'd seen enough battles to know that when an enemy is cornered, they strike wild, without precision, without logic. Desperation is its own kind of violence. I forwarded the letter to Elena. She called me 30 minutes later laughing. Textbook intimidation, she said. And very, very stupid. They're going to regret this. By the next day, she'd filed a countersuit not just in response to their letter, but to escalate our original case. We now sought full reimbursement for property damage, environmental remediation costs, legal fees, emotional distress, and a formal injunction preventing any future interference by the HOA on my land. Meanwhile, public sentiment had fully turned. The petition to recall the board reached 144 verified signatures, well over the threshold. The city announced it would oversee the special election. A slate of replacement candidates emerged, most of them regular homeowners who'd never once been to an HOA meeting before, but were suddenly activated, informed, and ready to take the reins. It wasn't just about me anymore. The story had caught national attention. A CNN affiliate ran a segment titled, "Retired Veterans Pond Sparks Legal Showdown with HOA Tyrants." Social media ran wild with hashtags like #PondGate and #DrainTheBoard. Comment sections were flooded with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. I was invited to speak at a regional homeowners' rights conference. I declined. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. But I did agree to speak to a group of law students from ASU who were studying environmental law. They wanted to hear how a community collapsed when power went unchecked, and how one man's pond revealed the cracks in the system. The day of the hearing came. We met in a modest courtroom downtown. Elena wore her signature black blazer and carried herself like a weapon. I wore a simple dress shirt and brought one thing, the logbook I'd kept since I bought the property: notes, measurements, rainfall records, and restoration sketches. The HOA's remaining counsel tried to argue that the pond had always been a gray area, that the trenching was intended as a precautionary safety measure, and that any damage to my well or the aquifer was coincidental. Then Elena stood up and burned them to the ground. She showed the judge the footage, the trench being dug at 2:17 a.m. She showed the permit filed under false pretenses. She showed expert testimony, a hydrologist confirming the environmental impact. She showed resident statements, 37 households confirming water loss. She ended with a photo, the dried-up pond basin. Then the very next frame, my dock collapsed into mud like a grave marker. The judge didn't need long. He ruled in our favor. The HOA was ordered to pay full damages for all repair and restoration, issue a formal public apology to be posted on every HOA bulletin board for no less than 90 days, reimburse legal fees in full, and perhaps most satisfying of all was barred from initiating any further action against me or my property without a court order. It wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning. And as I walked out of that courthouse past the small crowd of reporters and neighbors waiting outside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not pride, but justice. Real, earned, undeniable justice. Back at home, the pond was beginning to return. The nonprofit had helped regrade the basin, line it with native plants, and shape the embankments to allow natural filtration. Rain had started to collect again. The trench had been filled, reseeded, and signed off by a state environmental rep. One morning, I stepped outside to find a great blue heron standing in the shallow water, motionless and regal. It was the first time I'd seen one in over a year. I didn't move. I just stood there and watched it, the wind soft through the cottonwoods, the air damp with rebirth. The HOA, now fully restructured, operated under new leadership. Carmen had been elected president. She called me the day after the results were certified. "We'd like you to serve as environmental advisor," she said. I paused. "You mean, like officially?" "Yes, with full voting rights." I smiled into the phone. "Only if we put the pond back on the map." "It already is," she said. "We renamed it Weller's Basin." I didn't have words for that. Only gratitude. Only silence. Only the knowledge that everything they tried to erase had come back stronger, including me. It started with rain. A slow, steady drizzle that turned to a whispering shower, soaking the earth with quiet purpose. The kind of rain that doesn't rush, that stays long enough to be noticed and kind enough to be welcomed. By then, the trench was long gone, buried beneath layers of new sod and native grasses. The scars on the land were healing softly, patiently, like skin that finally stopped being picked at. And the pond was coming back. Not just because of the rain, or the carefully restored topography, or the graded embankments. It was returning because we willed it to. Because for the first time since all this began, the neighborhood wasn't fighting against the land. It was working with it. We gathered on a Saturday. Not for a protest, not for a vote, but for something simpler, something rare in a place where community had been replaced with compliance. We came to work. Neighbors brought shovels, wheelbarrows, and work gloves. The HOA, now under Carmen's leadership, provided food, bottled water, and tarps to sit on during breaks. Teenagers rolled out erosion mesh, couples laid down seed packs, and old-timers like me stood back and directed, pointing with calloused hands and nods of approval. Someone set up speakers and played old country songs. Kids splashed in puddles. For a moment, it felt like a picnic from another era. I'd spent most of my life doing things alone, missions, maintenance, morning. But that day I wasn't alone. People I hadn't spoken to in years worked beside me like old friends. Doug, the smug board member who once tried to sneak 10 gallons of water past me, showed up with his son and planted milkweed near the north bank. Ms. Halberd, the widow who used to yell at kids for stepping on her rose beds, handed out cookies. She'd baked herself sugar cookies shaped like frogs and dragonflies. Even Cheryl showed up. She didn't say anything at first, just stood at the edge of the crowd in a plain gray jacket holding a small potted lily in her hands. Her hair wasn't perfect anymore. Neither was her face. But when I caught her eye, I saw something I hadn't before. Humility. She walked over slowly and offered me the plant. "I never said I was sorry," she murmured. "I took the lily. Now you have." She nodded once and turned away. We planted the lily together at the southern tip of the new water line. No applause, no photos. Just two people doing what should have been done from the start, respecting the land and each other. By mid-afternoon, the basin shimmered with shallow rainwater. It wouldn't be deep enough for fish for another few weeks, but the frogs were already back. Tiny green dots clinging to rocks, croaking in chorus like they'd never left. I sat on the rebuilt dock, my boots muddy, my shoulders aching in the best way. And beside me sat Carmen. She passed me a thermos of coffee. "You know," she said, "there's talk about putting up a sign. Something small, just a marker." "For what?" "To remember all this," she said, motioning to the pond, the people. "To remind whoever comes next that this wasn't always here, and that it came back because someone fought for it." I looked out across the water. "It didn't come back because of one person," I said. "It came back because people stopped being afraid." She smiled. "Well, we stopped because someone reminded us how." I didn't respond, because I wasn't used to that kind of credit. But I let the silence stretch between us, warm and real. That night, when everyone had gone, and the sun slipped low behind the ridge, I stood alone beneath the cottonwoods. The wind stirred the tall grass. The moon broke through a patch of clouds, silvering the surface of the pond. And I remembered. My wife sitting cross-legged on the old dock, sketching the waterline in her notebook. My son knee-deep in muck, laughing as he tried to build a makeshift dam out of sticks. The sound of ducks in the morning. The glow of fireflies in July. None of it was gone. It had just waited. Waited for me to stop mourning what was lost and start protecting what remained. Waited for all of us to stop obeying and start owning, not just our land, but our responsibility to it. And now, standing there with the scent of wet earth in the air and peace settling around my shoulders like an old friend, I realized something. They may have drained the pond, but we refilled it. Together. And what we built this time, it would never be theirs to destroy again.